This offseason is going to be a busy one for the Toronto Raptors. 3 key unrestricted free agents filling out the staffing positions for the newly hired coach, and the decision that's most close on the horizon, figuring out who to choose in the 2023 NBA Draft. The Raptors have the 13th overall pick in this draft, which is far from the ideal spot to be in, but it is technically the second best position their own first round pick has been in over a decade. Note, I said their own pick. Jakob Poeltl at 9 does not count. That was a Knicks pick that they acquired via trade. As for answering who will the Raptors select, the tricky part is that we don't know what moves the front office will make in the offseason. Reportedly, they're set to make significant ones, but how exactly do they define significant? Because that can mean anything from trading Pascal Siakam to using the MLE to bring in, like, Christian Wood or Kobe White? I don't know, this free agency class is kind of weak. As far as my own speculation goes, I expect them to bring back every one of their free agents and make draft day or offseason trades to escape the luxury tax, but it's entirely possible that they move Gary Trent Jr. and Fred VanVleet in separate sign-in trades, and who knows what the return for either of those looks like, aside from, not very good because it's a sign-in trade. They could also just walk, but regardless, there is a demand for greater guard depth off the Raptors bench, as well as additional shooters to pair alongside Scottie Barnes, even if they are retained. And if there is one positive that can be said about drafting 13th, it's that in this draft, not only is it deep enough that you can get a pretty decent player with that pick, but there aren't that many forwards in the Raptors' range, or at least consensus players where the Raptors are expected to draft. There's one that's expected to go from 10 to 15, 1 or 2 in the top 10 who might fall, and a few others who are wildcards where you could see them going as high as 10 or as low as 25. When viewing the talent pool in the expected range of the Raptors' picks, the current construction of the roster, and its areas of needs, it looks like they'll choose a guard, but it wouldn't surprise me if they decided to reach for another forward if they think they can bring some shooting off the bench via the MLE or through a larger offseason trade, but I digress. Or if they decided to make some moves on draft night, like I said earlier, it's entirely possible they make a move to pick up another first round pick, or take a flyer on a second rounder. But who exactly are the players that are expected to be on the board at 13? Let's go over a few of the names, shall we? Consider this an introduction to one of the potential players that could be a Toronto Raptor on draft night. This won't be a deep dive into the individual players, so if any of them seem interesting to you, I'd highly recommend giving them a look on your own time. I should also point out that none of this is in any particular order, and apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's names. With that said, let's get started.
Rupert goes tearing down the other end. Great take from the youngster.
When it comes to prospects that might as well scream Raptor at the top of their lungs, Rayan Rupert is near the top of the list. 6'6" with a 7'3" wingspan, gifted defensively, but a little... very rough on the scoring portion of the game. He's a terrific one-on-one defender, good screen navigator, has a really nice handle, but the 3 part of being a 3-and-D wing... oh boy. When you were shooting under 27% off your catch-and-shoot threes, you were going to be a problem down the stretch of close games, no matter how good a defender you are. In fact, he became flat-out unplayable for his team in the NBL Finals. His shot doesn't look like it's broken necessarily, and he is one of the youngest players in this class, so there's plenty of time to figure that out. Heck, his free throw shooting is actually pretty decent at around 74%. But the Raptors need more immediate firepower, more scoring off the bench than it does yet another lengthy defense first wing who struggles to get a bucket in the clutch. They also need a ball handler and playmaker, and he has shown some playmaking upside, but his offensive bag right now is pretty lean at the moment. Rupert is an interesting player, but unfortunately, one that isn't really what this team needs, at least if they only pick at 13. He does have a lot of upside as a wing, and like I said, he fits the Raptors archetype. He has one of the more underrated chances to be selected on draft night by the Raptors, though I'd say he's probably more of a candidate if the Raptors decided to trade down, rather than directly draft at 13, but we'll get to that scenario later. Now, as for somebody who the Raptors have a much more likely chance of choosing at 13...
Miller guarded by Davis as they get a trap at midcourt. Nick Smith with the steal and the jam.
Nick Smith Jr. is one of the hardest players in this entire class to properly evaluate. He was the consensus number 3 draftee going into the college season, but Said season was rough, and it really hurt his draft stock to the point where he could conceivably fall out of the lottery. Playing a mere 17 games in college and not looking terrific while doing so is not a great combination for a prospect. And there aren't that many players who were good to great in high school, but bad in college that went on to have productive NBA careers. It happens, but such prospects are incredibly rare. However, Nick's subpar season requires some context. For one, there's a major reason why he missed out on so many games. He was dealing with a major knee injury that kept him out for a long time. Like I said, going into the season, Smith was considered a lock for the 3rd overall pick, the #1 prospect from high school, and there's a reason why he was so highly touted prior to his poor play in college. A 6'5" guard with a 6'9" wingspan, a slick scorer with astonishing touch near the rim, and the quickness to beat defenders off the dribble, Nick Smith looked terrific, like his game would easily translate to the NBA as a shoot-first guard. This is going to sound like a weird comparison, but Smith Jr. kind of reminds me of OG Anunoby, not necessarily as a player, but from their pre-draft predicament. Both were guys who came into their college season as a projected top pick, whose stock only had down to go, and did so largely both due to suffering major injuries. That doesn't mean you should discount everything you've seen in his college season, but that injury should help to inform you, to provide some perspective on why his production took such a massive nosedive. That said, in college he did have a habit of defaulting to shooting in the mid-range, but whether you can attribute that to poor shooting spacing on his college team, the Razorbacks weren't exactly great at giving him much room to operate in, his injury not letting him burst off the dribble to get to the basket like he did in high school, or just a general bad habit that you hope to transition him out of and into more three-point attempts, that's debatable. Speaking of which, while he only put up three-pointers at a clip of around 33%, it is worth noting that his jump shot still looks great, and his free throw percentage wasn't bad at around 74%. I've seen comparisons to Tyler Hero, but I can't say I agree with that fully since, while Nick Smith isn't necessarily a great defender right now, Hero was never that great of a distributor in comparison. Nick strikes me more as a CJ McCollum type who can, at least on paper, end up as less of a defensive liability. A capable shooting guard with the handle and playmaking ability to play the one, and possibly even excel in that position, if forced into it at the start of his career. Smith would certainly be a risky pick because you never got to see him play healthy against college-level competition, so who knows how well he does in the NBA, but he has arguably the highest ceiling among the guards in this range, and the only reason he wouldn't be worth considering is if you're more of a believer in two of the other guards that could be in this range hitting their own ceilings in comparison to Smith. I could very easily see a scenario where a team late in the lottery, or even just outside of it, grabs Nick, Smith balls out, and is considered a steal by the team that gets him. You know, one of those players who eventually goes top 5 in a redraft.
Here's the freshman George, stopping on a dime. Now, dribble, switched hands, and makes the shot. Wow!
A genuine 3-level scorer with a large frame and a terrific first step, Keyonte is one of those combo guards in this draft that definitely leans more into the shooting guard side of things. His ability to make tough shots, his buttery smooth jumper, his general confidence as a scorer, it's everything that this team needs in a designated bucket getter. And while he's not quite a good playmaker to become a full-time point, he's shown enough potential in the pick and roll to be a secondary ball handler. That said, his shot selection is not great. I don't think it's as big of an issue as others have made it out to be, but part of the reason why he has gotten a reputation for taking difficult shots is because he chooses to take those difficult shots when he can't get into his spot. He's a good shooter, the mechanics are all there. He was a key contributor to Baylor having one of the best offenses last season, but his decision-making on offense is not ideal at the moment. I've seen some criticisms about Keyonte's efficiency. I personally don't see the issue, or at least not as much as other people do, as a red flag. Most college shooting guards don't enter into the league as these hyper-efficient snipers. Just take a look at the college performance of the most oft-compared player to Keyonte George, Bradley Beal. His field goal percentage and even free throw percentage, one of the best indicators of a player's potential as a three-point shooter, they are strikingly similar, and I don't know if you've noticed, but the Raptors could certainly use a player like Bradley Beal, except, you know, not on Bradley Beal's contract. See also, All-Star Anthony Edwards. His college true shooting percentage was 52%, which is about where Keyonte's true shooting stand. And like Nick Smith, merely looking at the stats ignores some key context. Part of the reason why his percentages look worse than how he actually plays when healthy is because, well, he wasn't near the end. George suffered an ankle injury partway through the season, and he ended up playing through it, much to the detriment of his performance. If you actually watched George play when he was healthy, you would see a super talented, bucket-getting guard with all-star upside. Stat-wise, his splits, and even pouring over the advanced numbers, they are around what Anthony Edwards was putting up in college, albeit with Edwards showcasing worse three-point shooting. Now, just so we're clear, as far as the eye test goes for Keyonte, George is no Edwards as a prospect. He doesn't play like him, and he doesn't quite have the same level of speed and otherworldly athleticism that Ant does. Then again, few players do. But you could see the talent behind the guy once touted as the most prolific scorer in this class. I'd say describing him as Bradley Beal but not a terrible defender is a very fair assessment. A score-first guard who can be a playmaker on occasion, but isn't necessarily going to be relied upon as the point guard of a team's future. If anything, they're a guard who can probably benefit from a good point guard, or a point forward like Scotty Barnes. He's been a bit inconsistent on the other end of the floor, but at least he puts in the effort and is promising enough to not completely write off as a career liability on D. I really like Keyonte George, if that wasn't obvious already. He's probably my favorite or second favorite of the prospects in this range, and I think he's good insurance in case Trent or Fred, or both, walk in the offseason, so there's at least some three-point shooting besides OG, and hoping Otto Porter plays for more than 8 games.
Now Wallace turned his back to the defender. Oh my goodness!
You can never go wrong with the guard from Kentucky, as recent history has shown, and Cason Wallace has a lot of things going for him. There's been this sort of movement over the past few drafts towards jumbo-size 6'6" to 6'8" point guards, and yet Cason Wallace stands taller than most of them as the best point attack defender in the entire class despite being 6'4". Not just amongst guards, for the record, the entire draft class, period. But he's a lot more than just a pesky POA defender. Great off the catch and shoot, a solid ball handler, and all-around great playmaker, Wallace is a high BBIQ, true point guard that's always going to make the right play. His overall offensive bag is still a work in progress, but the signs are there for him to be at least decent from 3, plus he brings some much-needed ball handling off the bench, or to start depending on how things turn out with Fred VanVleet in the offseason. There's not a whole lot to criticize about his game. Cason is just a really solid defensive point guard. He's been getting a lot of comparisons to Drew Holiday, and yeah, you can definitely see a lot of that in him. You just hope he doesn't develop Drew's patented playoff choking performances.
Brutal schedule down the stretch. Bowie had his pocket picked by Bufkin.
The first thing anybody talks about with Kobe Bufkin is his finishing ability. 71% at the rim is bizarre for a 6-foot guard. It's bizarre for a guard in general, but it is certainly a noteworthy positive, and he's crafty at getting to the rim. He's not afraid of contact either. Bufkin is one of the more popular prospects right now, and he's been something of a draft riser of late. I've seen him getting mocked to the Wizards at 8, and I get why he's appealing. He clears the eye test, he's a well-rounded prospect that doesn't have many notable flaws, but he's not exactly elite at any particular skill that isn't related to his finishing. He's a decent shooter, but he's not knocked down or anything, and he's not exactly high volume for that matter. He's a solid athlete, but not quite explosive. He showed some promise as a playmaker, but he didn't get a ton of opportunity to show it off in Michigan, and he was prone to turn the ball over a lot in the pick and roll. He had a really hot streak near the end of the season, where he shot around 45% from 3, but that sort of offensive production is rarely sustainable. The one other thing that does stick out about Bufkin besides his finishing, he was shockingly good as a shot blocker, doubly impressive when you consider his position. You're obviously not sticking him at center to guard the paint, and he isn't the best defensive guard on the list, that's Cason Wallace, or debatably Anthony Black, but he can certainly hold his own on the defensive end, and he was decent enough at picking the pockets of other opposing guards. He did improve a lot this year compared to his previous season, while still being one of the younger prospects in this class, so with Bufkin it's really a matter of where you think his ceiling is, because his floor entering the NBA is pretty high.
A 42-38 edge here, Sensabaugh with the takeaway. Behind the back dribble, he'll take it in, a finger roll.
So, like I said, there aren't that many forwards that could go in the 11 to 15 range, barring someone dropping, but Bryce Sensabaugh here, he is the exception. In 3 words, a certified bucket. He's not quite a volume scorer, but he's got solid shooting mechanics. He's 83% from the 3-throw line, and while his 3-point shooting in college should be taken with a grain of salt since, well, they use a shortened line, 40% on a healthy 4.5 per game is nothing to scoff at, let alone being nearly 46% on the catch and shoot. He's great in the paint, magnificent in the mid, he can splash from outside, he can even draw fouls at a solid rate. He's a complete package on offense. What is questionable is his defense. He's gotten a lot of comparisons to DeMar DeRozan, and while it's not a perfect comparison, DeMar was never a good 3-point shooter and Sensabaugh is a really bad playmaker. You can certainly see him having DeMar-like lapses on the other end of the court. He has potential based on his size, but that's about all he has going for him on that end right now. He's simply a bad defender. If nothing else, Sensabaugh would definitely bring some much needed firepower off the bench, but his struggles on the other end of the floor could be a problem late into the game.
Drives it, stripped away. Fast break opportunity. There's the lob. Oh, it worked!
You know how I mentioned Rupert was a very Raptors-y prospect? Well, Schifino is the antithesis of that, because the Raptors are kind of a team that love prospects with strong advanced stats, and Jalen Hood is a guard with a true shooting percentage of 49%. Let me repeat, 49% true shooting as a guard. To say he's a poor shooter would be an understatement. He is remarkably inconsistent, and to be perfectly frank, inconsistent is a very generous description. In fact, a lot of the advanced stats for him are, let's go with unfavorable towards him. Now, stats aren't everything. The eye test would show that Jalen Hood is a good off-ball defender, but being a decent defender in general is about the only area where he excels at. He's not a good finisher, his handle is too loose, he takes way too many mid-range shots, and did I mention how bad he is at making them? The only thing that is going for him besides his defense is being athletic and 6'6" as a guard. But he's not good at the thing that guards are supposed to be good at. I am genuinely baffled that Schifino is being mocked this high. And with his horrid advanced stats, I would be shocked if the Raptors of all teams drafted him. Sorry to end things on a negative note, but those are the main candidates. Now, there are a few potential draftees that might be considered a stretch, a reach if you will, who are nevertheless worth consideration.
Henderson comes up with it. Chance for the tie. Reversed by Miller.
So, fun fact. Leonard Miller was one of the guys we were looking at in last year's draft before he chose to drop out and go to the G League Ignite. It turned out to be the right decision because, even though he still has a lot of flaws, there's a reason why 13 is considered a reach for him. He is much improved as a player. For a 6'10" forward, he's a surprisingly solid ball handler, owed to Miller being a guard before going on a growth spurt. In fact, that's probably the best way to describe him, a guard with the frame of a big man, still trying to figure out how to play at a new position. A good help defender who averaged a double-double the entire season, he's been a terrific rebounder, and late into the season, his 3-point shooting improved rather notably. That said, he's not exactly a floor spacer right now, and the mechanics of his shot look really awkward. And even though I said he's a good ball handler for his size, that's for his size. He's had his fair share of unfortunate turnovers. Also, he's Canadian. I guess that's important to some people. Personally, it's not a factor for me. We already have 2 Canadians on the roster. It doesn't really change how I feel about Chris Boucher or Delano Banton that they're Canadian. If it matters to you, okay. But yeah, he's Canadian. I guess I can mention that. There you go. Like I said, Miller was a guy the Raptors were interested in last year. I would not be surprised if they took him as a long-term bet on his upside this year because Miller, he has top 5 upside amongst players in this draft. And when I say that, I mean top 5 in a redraft, not top 5 as a play. You know what I mean. Speaking of upside draftees. So have you heard about this guy named Victor Wembanyama? Yeah, this guy was his running mate, more or less. If you remember what I said about Rayan Rupert, you can repeat just about every single strength and weakness that I mentioned there and apply it to below. He is raw. Yet another player in that Raptors-y mold of long, athletic 6'6" to 6'10" wings with underdeveloped shooting who are nevertheless solid defenders. As far as those guys go in this draft, Koulibaly has one of the higher ceilings. I'd say he has more upside than Rupert, and during the LNB's playoffs, he actually got more opportunities on offense. But, like I said offense is still incredibly raw, and his shooting form is really ugly. He's a fine enough slasher, but he's a complete non-shooter and his handle right now isn't that tight. Even though I classify him as a reach, Bill has actually been something of a riser as of late, and supposedly he's seen as a lottery talent with a promise from a team in the lottery that everyone expects to be the Raptors or the Thunder. Whether or not that ends up being the case, we'll find out soon enough.
Here's Brown, quick three. Jackson, the putback and a chance for three.
I'm going to get this out of the way right now. Of all the players on this list, G.G. Jackson has the biggest bust potential by far. Well, it's more accurate to say boom or bust, but the bust is much more likely than the boom. His shot creation and footwork for a guy who is yet to crack the age of 19 are unreal. His handle is solid. He has real star upside as a scoring wing with the size to bother opposing players on defense. At the same time, his shooting was inconsistent, even the mechanics look solid. He had trouble staying motivated on defense, and off-court he acts his age. It's really hard to be overly critical given some of the stupid things that I said when I was 19, but his immaturity should nevertheless be noted. There's a ton of potential with Jackson when he's this terrific a shot creator at this young an age, but he definitely needs to go to a well-run organization that is willing to play the long game, draft and develop him over time, possibly have him spend more games with a G League affiliate than an NBA team in the start of his career, rather than throw him to the Lions and force him to figure it out on his own for 82 nights. Yes, every one of these players has a chance to be a bust, nothing is guaranteed, but if he goes to, say, Houston at 20, it is going to be a disaster. He needs to go to somewhere with a lot more structure, like the Heat, the Spurs, or the Raptors. I will say that Jackson is a prime candidate to take a flyer on with the second first in the draft because it's hard to see him being picked up this early in the draft, even if you do buy his upside or consider his attitude to be something addressable.
Dick turns the corner, lets it fly for three. That one's good. One of the best strokes going in college basketball, Gradey Dick.
Yeah, his name is funny, haha, get it out of your system. Are you good? Okay, so Dick isn't a stretch in the sense that we'd be reaching down in the draft to select him, so much as it's a stretch to assume that he'd be available to the Raptors at 13. Why is that? Well, while Keyonte George might be one of the best all-around scorers in this draft, Gradey Dick is by far the best three-point shooter in this class. 40% from 3 on about 6 a game, a solid free throw shooter, and just the mechanics of his shots all indicate that he's going to be a walking bucket. But he's more than just a bucket. Don't let that mere 1.7 assists per game stat fool you. Dick has got great court vision and has shown that he can be a solid playmaker, and while he's not a good defender at this point, he is trying on that end, and that's why he's likely to not be available. Gradey Dick is a top 10 talent in a loaded draft who, barring several reaches, is not likely to fall low enough for the Raptors to realistically draft him. This brings us to the final consideration, trading up or moving down. As far as this draft goes, there's a few teams out there that have multiple picks and are looking to consolidate, or are planning to move one of their picks for a veteran that the Raptors could offer, along with the 13th overall pick to move up. The main candidate to look at would be the Mavericks. The 10th pick in the draft is high enough that someone like Gradey Dick or Cason Wallace should still be on the board by then, and Dallas could use a defensive wing like Chris Boucher. So pairing him with a 13th pick and taking back JaVale McGee for salary purposes could be enough to move up in the draft if the Raptors are dead set on getting a specific player. The Jazz are an interesting trade down option. If the Raptors expect a player that they want to still be on the board at 16, they could conceivably move down and possibly pick up the 20th pick in the draft. And while the 20th pick on its own isn't a great consolation prize for moving down, it's not like the Jazz couldn't offer a future first instead, they're loaded with them at the moment, that the Raptors could either use or trade down the line. The Indiana Pacers have a lot of picks in this draft. 5 of them in total, and they can't draft all of them. The problem with Indiana as a move down option is that said non-lottery picks are all late firsts or early seconds. It's a significant step down for their team to say the least. The same goes for the Brooklyn Nets, who do have back-to-back picks in the 20s. I don't think trading up or down is a likely option for the Raptors, but I'd say between the two that they're more likely to trade up than down, if only to move off of one of their bench forwards and shed some salary with the number of pending free agents that they'd have to resign while ducking the tax. I'd also be remiss to not mention that there's been some reports about the Raptors making calls for the 4th overall pick, which indicates they might want Amen Thompson. And then there's the Blazers shopping around the 3rd pick and Simons, but we'll save that for another video if that actually does go down. So yeah, that's the list. There aren't any players that I'd say are bad choices for what the Raptors need, or even players within their range aside from Jalen Hood. Even guys I'm not super high on, I wouldn't be mad if they drafted, say, Bryce Sensabaugh. There's a lot of mistakes that the Raptors front office has made in the past few years, but their pedigree for delightful draft steals is not one of them, aside from Malachi Flynn. Or if you count the fact that Christian Coloco was only picked in the second round because they traded out of the first to help Goran Dragic's contract for Thad Young in the second from the Pistons. What the fuck?